guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. She had kept a thread of hope for 3 years, a thin gold circle folded into the lining of a coat like a private litany. That hope lived in small things. The way he smoothed the paper over her sketches. The way he wrapped a borrowed scarf around her shoulders on cold nights. The mess of yarn and needles left where she had drifted to sleep after a fever. When the thread snapped, it snapped loud enough to leave shards. If you stay until the end, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell. There is a storm, and later, a promise worth waiting for. The plum garden smelled of ash and cold earth. Moonlight spilled over the lanterns, but could not lift the weight that sat on the stone steps. Shanshan, fingers trembling, face white where it had been flushed minutes before with panic. Her hand pressed at her belly with a movement that was equal parts protection and denial. The scarf Nan Xuan had knitted for her last winter lay beside her, smeared at the edge with something dark that pulled at the scent of iron beneath the lotus soup she could no longer taste. The ring was gone. She had not meant to be out at night among the thorned bushes. She had been searching for the ring that was supposed to be proof against everything. It had slipped off her finger in the argument, the single moment when words, sharpened by fear and accusation, had rushed past tenderness and landed in something hard. It had fallen by the yew and lodged where thorns seized fabric, and when she reached, the world had gone quiet, and there had been a hot, sick pulling at her that turned the plum petal night to a ring of light. Nan Xuan's footsteps thudded on the gravel. He moved with that practiced economy that had always unnerved her. A man who could order the city to stand still and yet could not stop the tide of his own guilt. He had found her before Moss did, before the neighbors whispered. He found her crouched over the hedges, the scarf clutched to her chest as if it could press a silver line back into place. Her hand was cupped, empty. "Where is it?" His voice held the brittle edge of someone who measured words like currency. She looked up, and in that look he saw the world closing. There was no accusation in her eyes, there was only the exhausted accuracy of someone cataloging loss. Behind her pupils, the garden blurred. "It is gone," she said. "I cannot find it." He knelt as if to help, and then did not touch the hem of her coat. The night smelled of smoke and something sweeter, petals burning, perhaps the remains of incense from the house. He wanted to ask 100 things. Had she been with Lin? Had someone taken it? Instead, his hands hovered uselessly, and for the first time in years there was no script to follow. She stood and walked away without saying more. The plum trees closed themselves to the shape of her retreat. Later, the rumor would say the ring had been found among the thorns, a hairline crack along its band like a fault in the earth. People liked to make symbols tidy. A ring broken meant a vow broken. A scarf stained meant care spoiled. But symbols were less tidy in the kitchen light or in the hospital corridor, where blood had a way of staining everything and leaving no clean metaphor behind. Shanshan left him the next morning with a paper bag of her things, the little gold circle gone, and the scarf folded like a contrite animal between sketchbooks. She left because the accusation had been quiet and then loud. because someone had said in a voice too public that the child in Miss Lin's belly was his, because someone, for reasons that would reveal themselves as greed and spite, had given weight to suspicion. She left because the proof they demanded existed like a scent she could not breathe, a tattoo misread, a photograph cropped, a quiet nurse whose memory could be swayed. Nun Xuan watched her go as if the world had been a carefully arranged plan and a single misfiled paper had toppled the whole archive. He felt the pull of remonstration and the more terrible force of not being able to stop her. His hands found the scarf she had dropped in the doorway, and he wrapped it around his own throat as if to press warmth back into the place she had left cold. That was the beginning and the end in a single breath. She left him for good, and remorse, slow and like ivy, began to consider his skin. 3 years before, Shanshan had been the girl with trembling fingers and a portfolio of sketches that smelled of sewing soap and hope. The design studio on the 4th floor had belonged once to a man named Ji, whose brother Moss had taught her to iron pleats with a surgeon's attention. She worked with rags of silk and equally fragile confidence, pulling colors together until they sang. Nun Xuan had come to the studio because his sister wanted a dress for a charity gala. He had stayed because the way Shanshan looked at color made a man used to commanding notice feel like a student. He was careful in public and careless in private. He would fix the collar if it sat wrong, and, with that same flat efficiency, make a sudden pot of soup when she came down with fever. Once he had sat at her window and unwound a thread of cashmere until it became a long strip of yarn. And then he had taught himself, with the patience of someone who had never needed that very patience before, to knit. The first scarf he produced had uneven loops and too tight edges, but when he put it around her shoulders, she had laughed with the kind of surprise that was almost a sound of prayer. Their ease collected small proofs. A ring slipped on a finger after a midnight confession, a promise voiced in a car while it rained and the city blurred by. A tattoo, a small hidden mark like an anchor that Nun Xuan had shown her one night when courage and liquor loosened tongues. These were not clichés to them. They were maps of the domestic territory that each had come to own in the other. Miss Lin arrived like heat. She was bright, decisive, a woman whose voice could change the course of a conversation. She had ambitions that rustled the same way silk does, loud, creative, unapologetic. She came into the orbit of the family with a pregnancy and a claim that she believed would cement her place. Her presence produced, in time, the kind of friction that exposed what had been only carefully hidden. The first argument was about a trivial thing, a misunderstanding over a misdelivered message, but beneath it lay all the older things: secrets, loyalty, the invisible ledger of debts and favors. Miss Lin found allies in corners where ambition collected: Gong Yi, whose smile never reached his eyes, and a cluster of people who believed in leverage above truth. They whispered of designs and debts and a business partnership that would bloom if certain alliances were secured. They suggested that a child could be a bridge. They suggested more sharply that they would take that bridge by any means necessary. Shanshan did not know at first that the ring would become a battleground. She continued to sew, to draw, to taste the salt in lotus soup when Moss insisted she eat. She went to the market with her aunt and let sunlight fall on the margins of her life. But the accusations arrived like small knives. That the baby Miss Lin claimed had another father, that the tattoo might prove something terrible if read the wrong way, that a photograph at the gala proved a closeness she did not remember. Rumors, once whispered, require a public to breathe. And so the family gardens, the studio lounges, the heady drawing rooms were all enlisted as organs of gossip. Shanshan learned in a few sharp weeks that social ruin did not need proof. It needed enough people to repeat the accusation with conviction. She grew thin from worry and from a secret old anemia that made her hands ghostly against the white of her sketch pages. The night she lost the ring had been an attempt at reconciliation, or perhaps it had been an attempt at proof. There had been a confrontation that felt rehearsed. Miss Lin's sudden reappearance at the studio, a camera shoving itself past the curtains, a whispered question in the dark that became a public display. Nanshan had stood there, corporal presence that anchors rooms, and for a moment the man who could order satellites felt very small. Words unspooled. Shanshan had felt herself suddenly light-headed, and the ring had slipped. She had chased it into the plum garden, and then she had lost something greater than metal. Nanshan's days after she left turned precise with the cruel precision of someone used to imposing order and finding that it slides off his hands. He retreated at first into silence, calling attention only when necessary, letting aides and lawyers consider damage control while he sat in a room where the scarf still smelled faintly of her. He ate the soup she had not eaten and found in the bottom of the cup the flecked taste of her warmth. Guilt is a slow fever. It breeds in the idle hours. Moss was loyal. He had been there, standing in the background of the workshop, taking on errands that had once been Shanshan's. He donated blood when the hospital asked, and he kept a list of petty obligations like someone compiling evidence for an argument he did not yet understand. He called old favors with doctors and nurses. He found small things Shanshan had left behind and kept them as if they were talismans. At first, Nanshuan's remorse was private. He would walk the plum garden at night, fingers worried at the scarf, rethreading the loops as if he could stitch time back. He would stand at the studio door and look at her empty chair, at a sketch with a corner dog-eared, as if someone had allowed themselves some small comfort in distress. He stopped sleeping. He began, in an ungoverned way, to read and reread messages they had sent each other, short salutations, a promise to call, pictures of mismatched socks. He clung to the mundane because it kept the shape of her. Then guilt became action. He tried negotiation, legal recourse, a bribe of public apology coaxed out in the wrong way, with lawyers and press statements that felt like bandages laid by hands that could not heal. But the wound was not made of paper. It was made of a life and of claims that had teeth. What he could not solve with money or influence, he tried with force. He called Miss Lin. He confronted Gong Yi. He broke silence into accusation and was answered with counters of his own. There were nights he would stand by her door and do nothing. A part of him believed that to storm in and demand forgiveness would make the apology cheap. Another part of him wanted to take vengeance so fast his hands would not tremble. He tasted both urges like bitter pills. Miss Lin's miscarriage was a hush full of questions. The news moved like smoke through a house, a quiet that settled and then a loudness of consequence. The clinic that had served the city for generations found itself at the heart of a rumor machine. No one described what occurred with crude detail. They used softer words, a loss, a tragedy, a collapse, because the human language at certain moments is too blunt for the tenderness required. Shanshan sat with a friend in a corridor and felt her own body register the event like an echo. She did not say, "I am sorry," because the word had become too messy. Instead, she brought soup and a knitted scarf and tried to be near someone who hurt. Gong Yi, who had been the architect of social advantage, celebrated in muted ways. His calculation was not cruel in the childish sense, it was rational and terrifying. Remove one obstacle, gain another's position. But rational actors make mistakes when they underestimate the human cost. Miss Lin's loss did not come with gratitude, it came with grief. And grief invited scrutiny. Shanshan sat with a friend in a corridor and felt her own body register the event like an echo. She did not say, "I am sorry," because the word had become too messy. Instead, she brought soup and a knitted scarf and tried to be near someone who hurt. Gong Yi, who had been the architect of social advantage, celebrated in muted ways. His calculation was not cruel in the childish sense, it was rational and terrifying. Remove one obstacle, gain another's position. But rational actors make mistakes when they underestimate the human cost. Miss Lin's loss did not come with gratitude, it came with grief. And grief invited scrutiny. There were whispers that Miss Lin had been reckless, that she had pushed a claim too hard, that she had attempted leverage, and that the miscarriage was her own body's final judgment. There were other whispers, quieter and edged with malice, claiming an intervention. A drink spiked at the after-party, a nurse bribed, a medication misapplied. None of these could be proven at once. Proof arrived in the slow drip of attention from those who cared enough to examine records. In the meantime, people took sides. Shanshan, who had once tried to be compassionate, found pity reserved for the popular and expedient. The police smelled of paperwork and perfunctory competence. They asked questions that scraped the surface. They filled forms that would someday be interpreted by someone else's moral arithmetic. No indictment was immediate. There were only a string of small decisions, CCTV requests, hospital logs, a nurse's hesitant statement, that, when assembled, could gather into a narrative. For Shanshan, the miscarriage turned suspicion into a weapon and then into an armor. People who had asked for romance and spectacle now demanded facts. In the studio, models whispered. Friends avoided the subject when she looked at them. She sewed harder. Her hands bled with the friction of needles and concentrated focus, and that was a kind of work that left no space for rumor. She pinned her grief to the inside of a dress like a secret lining, and moved in public as someone wearing diplomacy as cloth. The first public confrontation came at an event that had once promised to be gentle. A small exhibition of young designers where Shanshan had 3 gowns on a mannequin and a portfolio of sketches. The room smelled of glue and new paper and perfume. Nanshan arrived late, which is to say he arrived in a way that announced himself without an entrance. Miss Lin was there too, luminous under the lights.
She looked suddenly small beside a cameraman who followed her like a persistent thought. Words moved between them like knives. Someone asked a question too loudly. Who was the father? Miss Lin's voice cracked on the line of the phrase. Someone cut in with an accusation that Shanshan had gone to extremes to undermine Miss Lin's position, that the studio had been sabotaged, that the ring had been hidden. People needed drama. They needed something to prove the truth they preferred. Shanshan stood at a table and watched the conversation like a collector watches a painting. She had a sketchbook in her hands, a page half filled. She remembered a morning when Nanshan had come with a small botched scarf and nothing else, and she had laughed until coffee spilled. She remembered less of the present. When the argument became a physical thing, Miss Lin advancing and someone else grabbing, Shanshan felt a pain in her, like the prelude to a faint. Her mouth went dry. She left, her hand unconsciously to the place on her finger that could not remember the ring.
Later that week, there was a photograph, cropped and toxic. It showed Nun Xuan and Miss Lin at a table, just after a small jostle at the exhibition. Nun Xuan's hand touched Miss Lin's arm in a way that 1,000 contexts could explain away. Someone took the single frame and sold a story. Touch because it matched what people wanted to hear. Touch because to the gossiping public it was simple fuel. Shanshan read the piece and felt the old anemia bloom like an ache. She burned a letter he had left near his toothbrush and kept the ash in a small tin. She could not tell if she was angry or tired or both. She went to the plum garden to find nothing but memory and the missing ring. The hospital was light and bureaucratic and wrong in every human way, because it reduced the unsayable to forms. Shanshan had been admitted after a slow bleed they could not explain away. The doctor said hemorrhage with the same clinical courtesy he used to prescribe iron supplements. He spoke of anemia, of a history of a previous miscarriage, of risks that increased with stress and malnutrition. He spoke of transfusion and observation, and asked delicately about family history. Shanshan answered in fragments, and let the nurse hold her hand, because someone had to. She slept in a chair and woke to a morning that smelled of antiseptic and oranges. The scarf was folded on the bedside table, like an accusation or a prayer. Nun Xuan arrived with an expression as if he had been trying on contrition and found it did not fit. He had arranged for the best doctors and had Moss on hand to handle errands. He had, in private, hired investigators to look into the Whisper network. At the hospital, he was mute and sharp. He would demand answers and then apologize for the force of his questions. He would stand in the corridor and breathe, a man rediscovering the interior geography of panic. At the center of it all, the medical team moved as if they were performing on a careful stage. Blood was taken, forms were signed. The possibility of surgery, of intervention, was raised and then set aside in favor of monitoring. Shanshan looked at the lines on the paper and felt her history turn to something else, a ledger of probability. She wondered what it would mean to survive this in a world that had already elected her guilt. The miscarriage, when it came, soft and devastating, was not a scene of spectacle. It was a private collapse with people around it, like a candle guttering in a room full of conversations. Miss Lin's name hovered in the corridors as a kind of scent. People made linkage without evidence and called it instinct. Shanshan mourned not only the blankness inside her, but the loss of the life she had imagined with a man who sometimes spoke to her with such tenderness she thought it might be a miracle. There was no miracle. There was only the slow work of gathering what remained. Against all of that, Nun Xuan's reaction was a study in raw arithmetic of the heart. He stopped delegating. He sat and read medical charts and sat some more. He took to sleeping in an armchair by her bed and waking at the slightest sound. His remorse had burned off the nobility of distance. He was left with the smaller, more honest thing, regret. He took his hands where they could not hurt any more, the knitting needles, and made loops in the night, rough, tight, a scarf that would not be perfect but would be honest. Investigation moved like a deliberate ocean. Moss found a nurse willing to speak to him in fragments, and a security guard remembered a late-night van by the clinic doors. CCTV footage, when requested and top quality, revealed a sequence of shadows and a figure placing a small paper cup near Miss Lin's drink at a party. The footage was grainy, corrupted at the edges by the camera's angle and the interference of warm bodies. It suggested rather than proved. It was, however, enough to prompt a lawyer to ask more pointed questions. Nanchuan began to gather proofs like a man assembling armor. He demanded access to the studio's visitors log. He called the gala photographer and asked for raw files. He insisted on a formal complaint. He had always been able to make people move for him. This time he needed a different kind of movement. He wanted truth to be public and undeniable. Opposition came in subtler veins. Gong Yi, who had profited from the confusion, started to smear in return. That Shanshan had sabotaged Miss Lin's health with negligence. That the studio had been involved in blackmail. He sought to make the story about character, not about facts. Social capital, when manipulated, can be as lethal as any blade. People who had once offered small kindnesses made themselves scarce. Shanshan found that alliances could rearrange in a single rumor's tide. One night, while Nanchuan watched security tapes with the clipped attention of someone who had never not had control, a frame blinked into existence, a gloved hand sliding something into Miss Lin's cup, a figure moving away with the ease of someone familiar with the place. The camera panned and caught in the doorway a silhouette he recognized, a man who answered to Gong Yi's outer circle. Nanchuan, who had been quiet with the pain, became spare with a different energy. An industry of legal minds would follow this. He did not leap to violence. Instead, he called a long list of people, one by one, until the circle tightened and the pressure turned. The public confrontation that would later be called the exposure was less cinematic than people imagined. It happened in a conference room that smelled of coffee and impatience. Nanchuan walked in with Moss and 2 lawyers and a packet of printed frames that might have once been insignificant. There were microphones and a photographer who took the sort of wide-angle shots that make people look small.
Miss Lin sat across the table with an expression that could have been grief or calculation. Gong Yi stood behind her, smile tight. "It was not my doing," Miss Lin said first, voice small. "No one forced me. I lost the child." The room hummed. Nanchuan did not answer her because his work was not with her. It was with the record. He placed the frames on the table, the grainy cups and the blurred gloved hand, and the long sequence of movement that culminated in a lunchroom dump. He slid the CCTV timestamps back like a film reel and pointed to a delivery van that had been recorded leaving the party 3 hours before. There was a pause, long as a held breath. Gong Yi's face, which had always been carefully composed, flickered. He called a lawyer to his side. The questions turned and found purchase as more witnesses were coaxed. A catering assistant remembered a man with a clipped voice.
An intern described a late-night delivery that had no paperwork. The threads began to braid into a story not of accident, but of design. Miss Lin's sorrow did not vanish. She had been a victim twice over in a single life, of design and of consequence. Her grief now existed alongside a dawning comprehension that someone else had made choices with her body as a vector of advantage. She cried in private and took long walks with an aunt who spoke with the bluntness of people who survived the world by naming its dangers. The result of the meeting was not immediate justice, but the release of an inquiry and the opening of a legal process. People who had felt themselves invincible found the new terrain of legal scrutiny uncomfortable. It did not excise the hurt, but it changed the calculus. The rumor mill cooled, at least in those circles where the law could be a deterrent. Shanshan watched the sequence like an outsider who had once been in the center. The ring remained lost. The scarf, folded on her chair, smelled faintly of his cologne and the ash of a burned letter. She began to realize that what she had thought the ring protected was never a ring at all, but the idea of being seen. Nanshuan's remorse deepened into a consuming thing. He began to spend hours in the studio working alongside Shanshan's assistants, learning the names of thread colors and asking how a bias could be cut to sit without puckers. He made tea that she liked and left it on the drafting table. He sat at her station and tried to trace a sleeve line without the practiced touch, and felt the frustration of hands that had always been used to different instruments. People saw the change and called it penance. Others called it something softer, humility. He stopped attending certain family dinners. He apologized 100 small times, always behind the guarded curtains of privacy. He wrote letters he couldn't bring himself to give. He gave money to a charity that Miss Lin recommended and set up a scholarship in the studio for a young designer who could not afford materials.
His world narrowed to a few things: truth, repair, and the scarf he kept working on when words failed. His obsession was not only with Shanshan's forgiveness, but with understanding how the mechanism of rumor had been so easily set in motion. He read legal memos and sat at depositions. He learned the fragile choreography of evidence and witnesses. He became, in a practical sense, a different man, one who preferred the slow, relentless measure of truth to the immediate comforts of power. Yet power has a way of leaving fingerprints. His attempts at reparation sometimes read as further demonstrations of control. He did not mean them to, but the history of a man who had been able to bend markets cannot shape its shape overnight. He apologized with deeds, and with that flat, watchful tenderness that had first drawn Shanshan to him, but which now sat under the microscope of caution. She, for her part, kept her guard not as armor, but as a necessary shield. To return to him would be to risk being consumed by the narrative that had nearly swallowed her. She had learned to measure affection in small acts. A chicken soup when her fever rose, a sketchbook left open on a table to make space for the world. She welcomed some of his changes because they made practical things easier. Legal fees handled, inquiries followed through, a name cleared in public. But the heart's work is not transactional. The absent ring was more than metal. It was a gap in the ledger of trust that procedural apologies could not immediately close. In the weeks that followed, small violences came to light. A storage attic at the family estate was cleared inadvertently, and a box of old things was burned. Letters, a scrap of a confession that had once meant something. The smell of ash returned to the plum garden like an old memory. A scarf that Shanshan thought had been lost was found folded behind an old armchair. It was singed at the edge, as if someone had tried to burn it and not finished the task. The ring remained elusive, its absence as much about identity as about property. Gong Yi, confronted with a wave of evidence and with the legal attention it invited, started to make errors. He missent an email that mentioned a document he had meant to bury. He appeared at a dinner and left early in an agitated way that did not fit his accustomed calm. For someone who had thought himself untouchable, the slow accrual of pressure had altered him. He sought allies who found distance more precious than loyalty. Miss Lin's path was jagged. She felt chastened and emboldened at once. She spoke in court with a voice that was sometimes steadier than Shanshan's had been, and sometimes trembled into confessions. She kept a small photograph of a sonogram in her purse, and would, on bad days, look at it as if trying to press a ghost into life. Her grief was public and private. She found that the truth did not run in tidy lines. For Shanshan, there were nights when despair arrived like a small, deliberate person. It sat down beside her sewing machine and waited until she had finished a seam. She would work until her hands were calloused and then fall asleep on the couch with a fabric on her chest. In those nights, she thought of the ring among thorns and wondered if an object could carry such weight of meaning. She would find herself humming the pattern that Nanchuan had once knit, and the sound would be a small balm. The month's crescendo did not explode so much as converge. Evidence, when assembled, has a brutal clarity. A lab confirmed residues in a cup. A delivery invoice matched the van in the CCTV frame. A witness to a private conversation admitted, under formal question, to hearing a plan that had been spoken in a bar. The legal net tightened, and the public started to realign its sympathy. Gong Yi found himself facing a small tribunal of men and women who had once eaten at his table. His empire of influence frayed in the spaces where money could not answer the moral ledger. He hired a lawyer who recommended settlement and secrecy. But secrecy is a poor salve for those who want to be seen with honesty. In the end, he did what many who fear consequence do. He chose the path that allowed him to keep as much as possible and to sacrifice what he could not defend. There was a press statement, composed and polished, that admitted to oversight and promised internal review. For many, that was not enough. For the legal process, it was the beginning of evidence. The court of public opinion opened doors to a slower but steadier accountability. Shanshan watched the drama unfold from a bench in the studio, where she had once worked until midnight. She had a cup of tea and a small notebook. She did not feel triumphant. She felt exhausted in the precise way of someone who has been on a long journey. The ring was still missing. The scarf was not perfect, but it held the warmth of a man learning to mend. After months of procedural movement, the moment that would be labeled by friends and enemies alike as the revelation arrived not as dramatic spectacle, but as a quiet day punctuated by a single phone call. Moss had been reviewing footage cross-referenced with an employee's social media posts when he noticed a detail. The man who had been seen on CCTV near the clinic had, in a picture from months before, been wearing a watch that had a unique engraving, a small plum blossom that matched the motif on a cufflink in Gong Yi's belongings. It was small, a human proof, but it fit the other fragments into a cohesive pattern. Moss, careful and tenacious, took the detail to a detective friend, and then, in an afternoon of telephone calls, the discovery became official. The detective found records of a courier who delivered to a corporate mailbox associated with one of Gong Yi's shell companies. The chain that had once been rumors now had a ledger.
A guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era Hain, that had once been rumors, now had a ledger. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The disclosure produced different reactions. Some people in the family felt vindicated. Others were wary of the damage such publicity could cause. Miss Lin wept in a stairwell, and then, with a sort of exhausted dignity, requested a meeting with Shanshan and asked to speak frankly. They met in an empty tea room that smelled of boiled leaves and quiet. Lin apologized with a voice that shook. She admitted to a fury that had made her hasty, and to a gullibility that had made her dangerous. She and Shanshan shared a silence that felt like the first breath after a storm. Nanchuan, who had been a study in remorse, felt for the first time a different kind of air. Relief combined with the new knowledge that exposure did not erase the months of hurt. He walked the plum garden with the scarf around his shoulders, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as a reminder. He had been consumed by remorse, yes, but consumption is a form of hunger, and confession is the first elderly step toward a diet of repair. Yet human stories do not knot neatly. The ring remained unaccounted for. People loved a symbol and suspected that the missing circle would be a final punctuation to the narrative. For Shanshan, the absence sat in her like a question she could not answer. Had he left it intentionally? Had someone stolen it? Or had the ring simply betrayed its promise by falling and becoming lost? The search became for her less about the object itself and more about the memory attached. She began to put things in order. She burned a spool of letters that no longer served her, and kept in their place a small tin where she preserved the ash. She sewed a lining into an old coat, and slipped into its fold a photograph of a better day. She worked on designs that took their cues from loss, a dress that suggested repair with visible patches, and a scarf collection that used deliberate knots as embellishment rather than concealment. Her work changed. It became a form of testimony. Nanchan, trying to translate his remorse into a practical offering, proposed a small exhibition in the plum garden to showcase the pieces inspired by the long season of their trouble. He wanted to make public the thing he could control, an act of contrition converted into a cultural statement. She accepted, not out of gratitude, but out of a peculiar exhaustion that made architecture of the small obligations necessary. On the day before the exhibition, as the plum trees bared their last petals, Shanshan went to the attic to retrieve an old box. She found, beneath a stack of old quilts, a packet of photographs, and, at the bottom, something like a relic. A ring, dust-mottled, and with a hairline seam at the band where someone had tried to press it back together. It had been inside a hollowed book, a hiding place perhaps chosen by accident, or by a hand that thought secrecy wise. The ring was not as she had imagined. It had been handled, it bore a faint smudge and a tiny nick that told of hard edges. A terra que perdeu e as pedinafres cadecem no sangue. As ações dos armazenantes mudam o equilíbrio de poder diferente.
For him, remorse was not a spectacle. It had become a landscape he lived in. And, In living there, he learned to be patient and to accept that some things might never return to how they were. But fate, as if tired of the neat scales of guilt and amends, had one more hurdle to place between them. On a rain-slimmed night, the world conspicuously small and gray, a package arrived for Shanshan. She opened it with the careful fingers of a seamstress and found, inside a small cloth, a note with just 3 words: "We know." The handwriting was no one's she recognized. It was not even a threat that named names. Instead, it was an assertion that someone watched them, and that the risk they had thought contained had not vanished. That night, they both felt the old fear climb their throats like smoke. They paused their knitting and sat facing one another, the scarf half-formed between them. Nanshuan's eyes filled with a resolve that was the child of anger and love. He had been consumed by remorse, and now he would be consumed with protection. He called the detective and had an extra man posted at the garden gate, and asked Moss to check the cameras twice. They converted the worry into vigilance. Shanshan folded the note and placed it in the tin with the ash. She had learned that survival was sometimes about small, deliberate acts. The pieces you packed away, and the things you kept. She kept the ring in a drawer, and later she would, with the same sort of careful economy, stitch its box back into the lining of her coat, so that the object would be with her, but not on display. The days carried on with a nervous energy that left little room for leisure. Work at the studio continued. Legal threads unwound in courtrooms. The donor committee accepted the seeds of Nanshuan's new initiatives. People called them reconciled. They were, in fact, people learning how to live with their choices. One afternoon, months later, a court document arrived that spelled out consequences for those who had plotted, not the theatrical justice of a dramatic arrest on the lawn, but the precise, grinding kind: fines, resignations, and the kind of reputational ruin that men like Gong Yi shift to the shadows. The court's language was dry but effective. He was forced to step down from several positions and to make reparations to those harmed by his machinations. The news made a few front pages before settling into the hum of normal life. Shanshan read the ruling in silence. It did not restore what had been lost. Loss is not the sort of thing one recovers with paperwork. But it offered, perhaps, the truest of social remedies: accountability that leaves a mark and a space to rebuild. She sat in the design studio and pulled threads through silk. She found herself, at last, able to work without the grinding worry that had once distracted her hands. The stitches flowed in a way they had not for months.
Nanshuan, whose guilt had once been a private storm, learned to accept that remorse is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a long apprenticeship. He continued his acts of restitution, not to barter for forgiveness, but because he believed in a moral economy that required consistent input. He would spend evenings at the clinic, helping administer an outreach program, or at the studio, teaching a young seamstress how to bias a hem. Their relationship, strained along every seam, began to reconfigure into something new. It could have returned to its old form. It could have dissolved. Instead, it became a project of patient reassembly. The ring, the scarf, the tattoo, and the ash all became artifacts in a strange museum of their shared history. Some nights they would sit together and exercise a simple, quiet companionship. A television playing low, the scent of soup warming the kitchen,
the slow, gentle knitting of a scarf that now held the rhythm of both their hands. It was not an immediate cure. Trust, once cracked, takes time to reform. But love, or whatever lingered in that territory between habit and affection, had learned new muscles: humility, patient listening, the ability to hold silence without suspicion. Months turned into a year. Winter came and left, and the plum garden shed its bare bones under frost, and then slowly disdain returned the tree to bloom. Shanshan's work gained a modest acclaim. Her pieces were displayed at a small gallery abroad, and the studio accepted commissions that respected the ethos she had cultivated: repair as beauty. Miss Lin moved away to a quieter town and enrolled in a course where she could teach what she had learned. She sometimes wrote letters and occasionally visited the studio, her tone gentler and more contrite than before. On a late spring afternoon that smelled of new grass and sun-raw linen, Shanshan and Nanshuan walked through the plum garden together. The air was clean of past smoke. They passed the hedge where once, in the dark, she had searched for a ring and found absence. She reached into her coat and took out a small box. He watched without expectation. In his eyes there was a patient tempering of hope. She opened the box to reveal the ring. Cleaner now, its seam repaired by a jeweler who had insisted on polishing not simply the metal, but the insignificance of ownership. She held it between two fingers and placed it back on his hand, not as a demand, but as an acknowledgement of what they had both been through. He fastened it around her finger with a tenderness that trembled. They did not speak of vows. They did not make pronouncements. Instead, they made a small, mutual promise to try again, this time with more humility and with the knowledge that their love, should it continue, would require the slow work of mutual repair. Behind them, the plum trees held their blossoms like a witness. The scarf lay forgotten on a bench, half knitted and finishing.